Let's get started. First of all, I am so excited to be here, not only because I know some of you personally, but also because this particular episode is one that has been on my list and agenda, I guess, in a lot of ways for over a year now, at least. Basically, this has been at the top of the list since the show Into the Backing started. I also want to commend each of you for being here because this was an incredibly difficult episode to get over the line. I have had so many people commit and then come back and say no, and big organizations too. And I know Nate, you're from Washington, DFO, or I guess not DFO. Sorry, I'm thinking Canada, Department of Fish and Wildlife. I have been denied by the DFO, NOAA, Pacific Marine Mammal Center, SR3. I mean, not always denied. Sometimes just we had there were like I think with one of them there was an internal conflict and it's just made me want to do this even more. So Nate, you are in Washington with Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I wanted to just kind of start off with a bit of what you do in the department, and then we'll dive into Dave and obviously you, Spencer, as well.
Great. Well, thanks, April, and nice being on the show here with you, Dave and Spencer. Nice to meet you both. Yeah, so
Thank
I'm Nate Pamplin. I serve as the Director of External Affairs with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. In that role, I represent the agency on a number of intergovernmental forums, but also do a lot of state tribal hunting agreements and marine mammal policy issues, among other things. And so, April, I would say I definitely don't speak to on behalf of one animal or one resource. I feel like our mission here is to conserve biodiversity, including salmon recovery and providing sustainable opportunities. And so, I'm as a government employee, I work on behalf of the public here to try to meet that end. So certainly not representing one sector or one perspective, but as you indicated, try to find that balance of conserving wildlife. So,
Yeah, we had a wonderful chat. When was it? About a month ago. And we're so aligned in so many different areas of this. So I'm really excited to have you here. I think that you're going to offer extremely valuable insight, especially when it comes to policy and history as well. So lovely to meet you in person, kind of. And then Dave, we spoke about pinniped predation, specifically sea lions, when we had you on the show quite recently. And maybe just for Nate and other people who haven't heard that episode, can you just give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, Nate, nice to have you. Spencer, pleasure to meet you. And April, always wonderful to be with you. Yeah, gang, I've been in the sport fishing industry my whole life. My family's been in the sport fishing industry since 1947. My father was pretty much a pillar of the community. If you went to any fish and wildlife meetings anywhere in the United States of America, you knew who my father was. He was appointed by Barack Obama to represent the United States of America and set the limits on tuna takes by the United States. He traveled all over the world, making sure that we always got our quotas. And we've been dealing with the California sea lion our whole career, our whole life. It's been a big time part of our lives. And my father was the very first person to ever take people whale watching in 1967. And we don't have the Festival of the Whales in Dana Point Harbor. We have the longest running festival in the United States of America. We started it in 1971 of any kind of festival. We are the longest running festival, and we are the whale watch capital of the world in Dana Point. We've been dubbed that, trademarked whale watch capital of the world. So the pinnipeds are a huge part of our life and our industry. They're a money maker, but they're also a money loser for us. We last year alone we spent 120,000 US dollars repairing our docks. We own 9 200-foot docks in Dana Point Harbor, and the sea lions use them as a haul out. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, this will be great. What is that beautiful little beast behind you that's up in the box with the long tail?
That's Marley. He's my marmoset monkey.
Oh
He's
my
a
God.
rescue monkey. My wife and I, we live in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, and when we moved down here, the neighbors had this animal in a cardboard box.
Oh,
And this was 3.5 years ago, and they tortured him, and they had little kids, and they screamed at him all the time. And he's the smallest monkey in the world. He's a finger monkey. He has come a long ways. For 2 years, we couldn't even touch him. Now he spends most of his days on my shoulder. He travels with us everywhere we go. He's like part of the family, but he was super traumatized, but he doesn't like missing the show. He likes, well, he knows when daddy's on the, and I do a live podcast 6 days a week. So he knows he's in part of it. He's part of the deal.
Oh, he knows you're talking about him. That is adorable. I hope people are watching this on YouTube so that they can see him. Spencer, this is fun because you and I haven't spoke in person since our last podcast, which was it was a few years back.
2019, I think.
Yeah, and a lot has changed since then. But I know that we were trying to arrange, it was a seal hunt, right? That's what I was invited on, and I
Yeah.
really wanted to come with you. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, I really want to experience this, but I can't share it with anybody because I don't want to deal with the hate. I don't know if I
Right.
care
Yeah.
so much these days about the hate, but I do care about the history and your thoughts on a lot of this, which you're kind of the surprise for me because I don't know your thoughts on this. So I think where we should start, well, actually, Spencer, let's start with you. Can you tell us a bit about your history? And then we'll segue perfectly into the role of, I guess, pinnipeds when it came to First Nations.
Yeah, for sure. So, hey everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Spencer Greening, and on paper, well, I'm an Indigenous anthropologist. On paper, I'm an anthropologist. When I first met April, I was starting my PhD, and this last year I finished, and oh, yeah, which is great. And now I get to focus on
Congratulations.
doing um, research that's more specific to what I'm into. So my community, I'm from the Tsimshian people. The Tsimshian of the Pacific, northern Pacific Northwest coast of British Columbia and then Southeast Alaska. And really, I'm doing postdoctoral research that explores what it means to be a harvester in an ecosystem that you deeply care about, what it means to take from that place, and the Indigenous teachings, reflections, and laws about harvesting. And so right now I'm looking at several different species in my territory. I work with elders, do the harvesting myself because I'm an avid harvester. And so, yeah, spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, living this stuff, and wondering how it all relates in today's society.
Just as a personal side note, I'm so bloody proud of you in so many different ways. You're just such a great spokesperson,
Thank you.
and congratulations on the PhD. That is no light task.
Good job, Spencer. Good job.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
The history. What did it look like back then, before us? What was it like?
I'm glad you asked that because I was just brainstorming some notes and a memory popped into my mind that I would have missed unless you brought this up, like the real history. One of the projects I've been working on is an archaeology project that is on our outside islands, where there are very few salmon. There would have been a few salmon runs on some of these islands we're working on now. There are none anymore. But a couple years ago, we found this unreal, like 8,000-year-old pinniped and whale harvesting cache, which just blew my mind, where you're digging in the dirt and the dirt, the soil, what we would call midden in archaeological terms. So the really compounded human waste of ash and shells and stuff. It's as if someone dumped a bucket of seal and sea lion oil on it yesterday. It's so beautifully rich and unreal. And to hold that and think, wow, 8,000 or so years ago, we were harvesting this species. And because it's on the outside island and there are less salmon, the vast majority of this midden is pinniped bones. So as we dig through them, there's just piece after piece of that how would you describe the like very porous bones of a mammal so they can a sea mammal so they can float. And it's just unreal to find this. And so traditionally in some of these areas of the coast, the vast majority of one's diet was probably seal and sea lion. And intermixed amongst those things, depending on where you lived, would have been supplements like rockfish, seabirds, or salmon if you had a salmon-bearing river nearby. You fast forward today, I mean, it was a staple for thousands of years. and still is in quite a few Indigenous communities up and down the coast. But there's been a real tumultuous relationship depending on where you are. But I think in most places in Canada, I'm ignorant to other countries, but you can look at the East Coast, the Arctic, or the West Coast, and the harvest of seal is, on some level, it's like a rarity in some communities, and it's very cherished. But it comes with political controversy. It comes with sort of movements that have made people shy to be a part of that practice, which in turn, over several generations, can make people lose not only the knowledge, but the taste for it and become accustomed to more Western mainstream societal taste buds. And so it becomes a part of this deep-seated practice has become sort of fodder in ecological arguments, environmental arguments, just animal welfare arguments, and like the modernization of remote places.
Yeah.
And so here we are today, where I'm one of a handful harvesters, pinniped harvesters in my community, and talking and thinking about this sort of stuff. With maybe we'll get into the details, but there are things on the horizon and neat modern conversations of where this hunt is going and what that might look like. But I'll stop there so I don't take
Yeah.
up your time.
That's great. I'm excited to get to the modern stuff, but I'm really intrigued about what you said with the midden. So, just out of curiosity, when you do harvest a seal or a sea lion, so let's say that, I mean, we're both hunters. So you make your incision and you cut down. What percentage of fat versus meat, how does it look if you're taking that animal home to consume?
It depends on the time of year, but often we're hunting from, I would say, most commonly in my territory, January until May. After late May, they start having their pups. They're obviously pregnant. We have a word, we call it waniish when it's a female who's pregnant and their back end floats more. So as a hunter, you have to watch. And once you start seeing that, you know their baby's developed, and it's against our law to start to harvest at that time. Once you see that waniish. Um, anyway, so if you're harvesting in January, February, those cold winter months, it's not uncommon to actually see more fat than meat in a lot of areas of the body. And I remember the first time I harvested a uh like a January seal, and the fat it looked like an inch or two thick, and then the meat was like less than an inch, and it looked like they're literally starving, but they have that amazing blubber layer that when you're cutting it, you can skin it off like a hide as well. So you take the seal hide off, and it's just such a thick layer that isn't marbled in the fat that you peel that layer off, and it's like three full layers of peeling, which is really interesting too.
Yeah. So historically, you would use, I'm assuming, the hide, the
Yeah.
fat, you'd render the fat. Would you use it for consumption and also for other methods or other practices?
Yeah, there's a lot of um yeah, mostly we render the fat, also just like general consumption. There's different recipes of cubed fat and fat attached to the hide. We eat the hide sometimes too. That's a delicacy. But yeah, rendered fat, not only as a food but and a medicine, but also as a storage technique. One of the ways that we would store foods long term is uh, submerge the food in a bentwood box filled with seal grease or some kind of grease. And seal grease and sea lion grease is quite prominent. And so that doesn't allow any air to get in, and then your food is preserved. So berries, yeah, whatever you want. Seagull eggs, bird eggs can be submersed in oil and kept longer.
Whoa.
Uh, yeah, I mean, that's,
The
yeah,
list goes on.
the list goes on. Again, I don't want to take up too much airtime, but
No, this is great. I'm going to shoot this to you in a second, Dave, because I just want to give you some context of my personal experience. I remember being out there. I was in, I think it was Tofino or Ucluelet, and it would have been 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. And I was with a bunch of old guys. These guys were in their 60s at the time. And a seal, I'm assuming, yeah, it was a seal, popped up. And they wanted to pull out a gun and shoot it. And I just remember thinking, what? No, it's so cute. And I'm wondering if that's where a lot of this modernized, the city person who doesn't want to hunt grizzly bears. Is it the same with seals, Dave? Have you seen in your experience the whole cuteness factor pop up?
It's absolutely incredible, the cuteness factor. And like Nate, you know this from up there in Washington, there's so many of these animals, and they're and the level of people getting bit by these is increasing ad infinitum because of the fact that they think they're so cute, and they don't understand the animal's called a sea lion, not a cuddly pillow. So they come down our docks, which we don't allow people on the dock, but they come down to get a picture, or they come down because they think they can pet them because they're so cute. But the animal, if you really get down to it, Spencer, if you start to look at the animal and look at their facial features and start to look at all they're full of grease, slimy grease. It gets all over everything they touch. You know that from harvesting them. So it's when you get down and you look at them close, they're not very cute, but they look cute from a distance. But when you get down and you look, and they got those big fangs, those big canines that hang down from the roof of their mouth. And then if they latch onto you, they have the bite strength 10 times that of a pit bull. They have the bite strength of a American alligator. So they're not a big cuddly pillow, but everybody in the world thinks they're so cute from all the pictures and everything. Therefore, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, Nate, you can help me with this. That's what makes them such a hot topic that you can't even touch. Like April was saying, Nate, had a heck of a, April and I and Spencer, we've been kind of dancing around this, trying to find somebody that would talk to us about it because it's such a hot subject. It's hotter than hell. We can't really talk about it. When April found out that they were eating her quote unquote, I call them April's fish, the steelhead, she was like, what? I go, yeah, they're eating them wide open, full speed. They don't even eat the whole thing. They just rip the belly out and throw the rest of the carcass on the bank and then gone to the next one. Because they're in the marine mammal world, they're one of the smartest animals right behind the dolphin, the California sea lion. So they know that there's another steelhead or another salmon coming to the fish ladder in a few minutes. They don't have to eat the bones in the head. But the fact that they're so cute from a distance, that they put them on this level that is absolutely mind-boggling. And we'll get into more of that later because this is going to be a good conversation to have for a while. But they were put on the Marine Mammals Act in 1972 by the then President Richard M. Nixon. And it was because, and Spencer, I don't know, you probably know more about it than I do, but this animal was almost hunted to extinction by Ralston Purina and Company. The dog food companies of America almost wiped this animal out for everybody. That if you had a dog in the 50s, they ate sea lion. I know it sucks to think about it, and that's terrible, but it's true. So Mr. Richard M. Nixon, the President of the United States, put him on the Marine Mammals Act in 1972. But what everybody forgot to read was, when they get to, I got it written down, when they get to a healthy and sustainable level, then it's time that we're allowed to start to harvest them or do whatever we wanted to do. But we haven't done that. And the numbers are higher than they've ever been because they have 120 to 220,000 years ago, they have record of the California sea lion. That's a long time ago. I know you're talking, Spencer, a small period of time ago where you guys found these bones and all this stuff, but almost 220,000 years ago, this animal was on the planet Earth. And right now, the numbers, and all we got is archaeologically figure out how many numbers there were back then is by the bones. The numbers are way bigger than they've ever been in the history of the planet, but no one wants to talk about that. And that's where the rub comes right now. And Nate, hopefully you can bring this home and explain to me why It's just such the most important animal on the planet Earth. It's got more rights than me and Spencer.
So I'd love Nate to just let's start super basic for people who are wondering what a lot of these policies and acts are. So what is the Marine Mammal Protection Act that Dave mentioned from 72? We'll start there.
Great. Yeah. And Dave, I wasn't aware of the pet food industry that you described, but certainly well aware of bounties on pinnipeds to as people were concerned about predation on salmon and viewing it as a competitor for commercial fisheries or sport fisheries and a very active pursuit of pinnipeds. And really, when I look at what was going on in the late 60s and early 70s, well, you had a broader environmental movement, as you noted, Dave, with President Nixon. There was the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, 1973, and the MMPA was passed in 1972. And during that time, you had the large whale populations in peril as a result of commercial whaling all the way through, gosh, even the late 60s. There was commercial whaling occurring off of the U.S. coast. You had the pinniped populations in peril, and you had dolphins being as bycatch in tuna fisheries. And so there was a massive public outrage about these species, and thus the MMPA was born. And I would stress that it is not called the Marine Mammal Management Act. It's not the Marine Mammal Conservation Act. It is the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And Congress did an excellent job in the 70s achieving that result, which is marine mammals are essentially off limits, and that there was a take moratorium, i.e., not only can you not do lethal removals, but the take moratorium is even on disturbance. You can't fly over when scientists are conducting counts of pinnipeds. You can't fly over a haul out without a permit to conduct that count. And if you bounce a pinniped, for instance, if you disturb a harbor seal and it swims off of the rock and launches into the water, that is a take. You change the behavior of the animal. So it is capital P protection of these animals. And Dave, you noted that, well, when the population reaches a certain size, well, then there's management provisions. And my take on the MMPA, that's not the case. The MMPA has a take moratorium, period. Now, there are exceptions for bycatch and commercial fisheries. There are exceptions for removal of nuisance animals that are individually identifiable, that are eating salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a couple other provisions that could allow for the exception of that take moratorium. But it isn't that a population reaches a certain size and then management is allowed. There's a zero mortality rate goal.
So they can be as many as they could be a zillion.
Well, that's not. I mean, yeah. So typically most animals are not like muskrats or something that can kind of continue to grow. There is a density dependence that happens, and animals will hit their carrying capacity. And we certainly have seen that with, for instance, California sea lions. They've hit a plateau, upwards of around 300,000 in the U.S. Coast, and harbor seals, at least in the four stocks in Washington, are generally considered at carrying capacity. Stellar sea lions that were recently federally delisted, so you have the ESA protection and the MMPA protection for the eastern stock of stellar sea lions. Their population is still in that exponential part of the growth curve. They're still on that steep part of the curve. We haven't even seen them necessarily hit that inflection point where they start hitting the plateau of their carrying capacity. So I don't think it's going to be zillions, but I do think that population anyway will continue to grow, and the other stocks are essentially at their carrying capacity.
Spencer, I know you have put quite a bit of time into looking into historical management. Do you have any thoughts on what Nate just said?
Yeah, I'm imagining this model of 300,000 and uh and comparing it to what we have on the coast, uh where we're looking at 110, 160,000 harbor seals. And I don't actually know if that's plateaued. I wish I knew. But what I've been told, and maybe anyone could correct me, but like a maximum sustainable yield of any species is kind of around 30%. And talking maybe of I don't know if seals, if that would give or take, but in conversations I've had with folks, people are thinking, well, if let's imagine opening up a resident harvest, um, non-Indigenous and Indigenous harvest in British Columbia, where you just took 5 to 10%, the population would still rebound easily from that. And so I wish I knew the numbers of what that looked like prior to contact, but all I know is that it was a very large part of the diet, alongside salmon in these areas. And and definitely, uh, like often when we're looking at historical records, there's oral history and then there's archaeology. The archaeology tells us there is constant pinniped harvest within the last 10,000 years, easily. Minimum, the last 10,000, could be 15. Um, and so there never was a break in that. And then uh, there's no oral history of there ever being like a drought of sea lions or seals, which there is of many other species that come with a whole array of here's these stories, here's these laws that become institutional within the nation, and all these things all prior to contact. That doesn't exist, which is interesting. But also, the thing that comes to mind is we're in this sort of learning journey of where do we fit into this ecosystem again? Because we've jumped from these extremes, since the sort of industrial era. Is like one extreme is there's this cull, there's this the word's slipping me that you used, Nate. Uh, but I remember my grandpa talking about during trapping season. This would have been in the 30s, 40s.
Oh, the
Uh,
bounty.
the bounty, that's the word. It was $5 a seal nose in the 30s and 40s, in British Columbia. And you would do that while you were trapping other fur animals. And and so that's like one extreme. And the other extreme is doing nothing and pretending that if we just gate these species or these ecosystems off and pretend we're not a part of them, that like something good will come out of it, which is the other case where you have this huge unmanaged species. And so, yeah, all I can think of is the question, well, where do we fit in this? And for me, it's like harvesting seals when I can, and knowing that more people on the coast should be doing it at this moment.
Yeah. I would in a heartbeat, just to make that clear to everybody listening. You can judge me all you want. I would in a heartbeat if I were allowed. And I I'm not allowed. Am I? Am I allowed to in Canada?
No, I think the only real commercial, it's funny because there's conversations happening. Maybe in the future it might happen, but like I think the only real marine mammal, I think there's guided walrus hunts in the Arctic, but like Finland has guided seal hunts. Maybe BC will one day, but yeah.
Oh, right. We'll
In
keep
the,
an eye
in
out
the
for that.
United States, that wouldn't be allowed, April. But
Okay.
Spencer, I agree with you. I mean, I agree with how altered the ecosystem is today. And a great example of all this to me is the Columbia River. And here you have a number of hydropower facilities taking a river into essentially a series of reservoirs, completely impacting salmon runs and fish passage, and creating a pinch point. And Bonneville Dam sits at river mile 149. And then in the early 2000s, some California sea lions following some Yulicon upriver decided to start hanging out and feeding at Bonneville Dam. And this is, when you're talking about in particular spring Chinook and all the salmon runs in the Columbia between electric ratepayers, taxpayer dollars, recreational fishing license revenue, commercial license revenue. There are hundreds of millions of dollars spent towards salmon recovery. And we've seen some improvements, whether it's the fish passage through the dams, through habitat improvements, how we had affected our harvest regimes or our hatchery programs. But an area that has been just unchecked has been pinniped predation. And that's where in about 2006, we actually applied for a permit under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to conduct removals at Bonneville Dam. And it had to be individually identifiable. This is under Section 120 of the Act. And so by individually identifiable, what I mean by that is we had to catch sea lions and brand them and then release them. And then we had to observe that that branded sea lion was actually eating a salmon, that that branded sea lion had been subjected to harassment, and that branded sea lion was hanging out at Bonneville Dam. And if the sea lion met all those criteria, we could then request to have that animal on a list so that if we caught it again, we could then remove it. And so we had conducted that way since 2006, and pretty much that whole time we were talking with our congressional delegation about amending the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which we did in 2018. And that provision now allows, it says, you know what, if a sea lion is above river mile 112, which is actually I-205, just kind of near the Portland airport in Oregon, if a sea lion's above river mile 112, it meets the requirements of being individually identifiable. And thus we don't have to do the catch, brand, harass, observe, document presence, et cetera. We can just capture the sea lion and remove it. And that's true for the main stem of the Columbia above the I-205 bridge, as well as tributaries to the Columbia where there's listed salmon. But again, 12 years, and really I think that the public opinion got there because of all the efforts we're doing on salmon recovery, the documented predation rates of pinnipeds in the Columbia River. And I can go into that in a moment, as well as southern resident killer whales are highly imperiled, and their preferred prey is Chinook. And we've got to do something here to turn the dial on Chinook recovery to help aid our efforts on killer whale recovery. And there was a report that came out in 2018 by Washington Governor Inslee that laid out a number of strategies, and two of those strategies had to do with pinniped management actions.
Whoa, this is so interesting, and there's lots to unpack here. As far as the harassment or observation of harassment, as in the pinniped is being harassed or harassing?
Great, thanks for the opportunity to clarify that, April. So this was our partners through the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission was on a boat and harassing sea lions, trying to interrupt sea lions preying on salmon. And so when they would harass an individually marked sea lion, that would be documented that, okay, this is one that had been harassed. And typically what happens is, a boat's pushing a sea lion away, and then the sea lion just goes underwater and pops back up at the dam and continues eating. So it's animals with that draw and that food reward are not going to react to the negative stimuli of a boat following it around and shooting at it with like seal bombs and firecrackers and things like that.
So note, when I die, I would like to come back a sea lion because they seem to be the most protected species on the planet. What the Marine Mammal Protection Act cannot be, like you said, emphasis on the P. It has to be protected. So they couldn't Well, you said there's been amendments in 2018, so we'll get to that. But at the time, in that time period, they couldn't just change it so that they could take a few and kill them?
The provision that I talked about that we originally secured in 2006 was actually amended into the MMPA in 1994, and that had to do with response to sea lions feasting on steelhead at the Ballard Locks, and having this ability to remove individually known animals. And so that's where this provision, this management provision, is not talking about a population reduction or anything like that. It's like what are the individual sea lions that are causing the problem? And so when we think about applying 120 to other scenarios, whether it's Puget Sound or the outer coast where there's documented pinniped predation issues that might be inhibiting salmon recovery, it's really challenging to meet that individually identifiable criteria. With sea lions, we're able to capture and brand them. But what was nice as far as what allowed it to really work is at Ballard or at Bonneville Dam is you had people standing on top of a concrete structure looking down and watching the predation and can tell that it is that branded animal that is eating a salmon, and is this unmarked animal that hasn't yet, or is this other marked animal that we haven't observed eating a salmon yet?
Two questions on that. As far as the steelhead story or the steelhead situation, is there any data on what happened to that run? Did it come back stronger or is it gone now?
Yeah, the winter steelhead prop stock, I believe, was extirpated in Lake Washington. The in Willamette, the winter steelhead population was predicted to be extirpated, and a lot of factors here. It's not worth finger pointing. There's all the typical threats of salmon recovery, but there was a group of sea lions that moved in at Willamette Falls and was feasting on winter steelhead, and the population viability analysis predicted that stock was going to blink out in just the next couple 3 decades, and the predation rate, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was 15+% of the run being documented to be consumed at Willamette Falls. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife removed just a handful of animals under this MMPA authority that I'm describing, and the predation rate now less than 1%. And so, we're not talking about, even though there's 300,000 California sea lions in the population, I want to be very clear. I'm not advocating for a broader cull. I am, we've documented that having the surgical ability to remove animals in these pinch points can provide the relief and allow salmon and steelhead populations recover.
In how many instances do they come right back?
Well, we have certainly tried over the decades of doing sea lion work of capturing an animal and moving it like off to the outer coast and stuff like that. And kind of depending on the travel distance, it can be they're back in like 3 days.
How many of them come back?
Well, in the relocation efforts, they pretty much, I don't have the stats on it, but it's a high return rate.
All of them.
So what does it cost? The amount of energy and money to relocate them for 3 days? Is it all optics, Nate?
Well, that's yeah. So April, though, that was earlier efforts when we did not have even this initial authority. But in other locations, we don't have the authority, or we have not applied for authority because of how difficult it is to achieve that standard under this one provision of the Act to be individually identifiable. But
What happened in 2018?
well, a couple things. You had the Governor Inslee's Killer Whale Task Force come out with a number of recommendations, and that's also what really spurred the amendment of the MMPA that allowed for that ability for us to remove sea lions when they're in a geographic envelope rather than this mark, catch, and release cycle we were in.
Dave?
Yeah, the black and white dolphin saved us. Thank God for the killer whale. Like my father used to say, you won't believe this. And I'm like, what? He goes, killer whale just cracked the code, son. And I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, this killer whales are starving to death. So now we get to do something to the sea lions finally. What I would ask though, Nate, Not combative or anything. I'm just asking, where did you get this 300,000 number from?
That's in the stock assessment that's published by NOAA Fisheries for California sea lions, and so it's around 275,000 to 300,000. So if I did a rounded error off the cuff, so be it. But they're in that ballpark.
All right. Well, those of us that spend our whole lives out on the ocean, we know the number's way bigger than that. I can take you to Catalina and show you 200,000 animals there, but that's neither here nor there. That's not what we're talking about today.
Right. Well, that's the thing.
I live in
When I
Cabo.
look at like harbor seals, and you look at the population estimates of those, and you figure that a harbor seal needs to eat, or a sea lion needs to eat, 8 to 10% of their body weight per day. You can get some pretty eyebrow raising statistics on the biomass that pinnipeds are consuming along the West Coast. Estimates of harbor seal predation on salmon is pretty extraordinary. There's a paper that came out by NOAA Fisheries here this summer that suggested that harbor seals were eating between 9 and 20+% of the outmigrating steelhead smolts in the Nisqually estuary, and that's impacting that ability of those smolts to return as adults and spawning. So it's definitely an additive source of mortality.
Like we talked about in the beginning of this is a highly, now we're not talking about seals, harbor seal, different animal. We're talking about the California sea lion. This is a highly intelligent animal. Like they don't even know how smart this animal is. The military uses this animal. A lot of people use this animal. This is a highly intelligent animal. This is the animal you see when you go to the amusement parks, carrying the ball around, honking the horns, doing all kinds of tricks. This animal is so smart. We don't know how smart it is. But when this animal is communicating with its friends and family and telling them, hey, if you go over here and hang out at this dam, food's going to show up every 3 minutes. There's going to be another food to show up every 3 minutes. So you take that one animal out of there, 10 more jump in there. As you get up into these rivers and streams and lakes, and we have a huge problem with this, with the largemouth bass in the Columbia River, and as you go up into the Sacramento River, and you go to any of these rivers that connect to the ocean where the sea lions can get in, they're eating largemouth bass. Nobody even talks about it. And I guess we can show you videos of it and stuff, but still that's not, you have to see it for yourself. But it was like I was on Cliff Gray's podcast last night talking about this animal. It's the same thing as when we reintroduced wolves into Colorado and Wyoming. And here's an elk hanging. Just think about this for a second. Here's an elk hanging out. She's bedded down with her baby. She's never seen a dog that eats her babies. And all of a sudden, there's dogs eating her babies. She's like out of her mind. She's like, where did this come from? Same thing in these rivers and streams. Your steelhead, your largemouth bass, your schmelt, your whatever you want to call the fish. They've never seen this animal before. Spencer, in your tribe's lifetime, these animals weren't up in these streams and rivers because they would have been eradicated immediately. If you guys saw one up there, you're like, wow, God just gave us food right here. We don't even have to get in the ocean. But that never happened before. But these animals are so highly intelligent. They're like mind-boggling intelligent. I live in Cabo. We have a giant estuary down here called Magdalena Bay. Now there is a rookery on Magdalena Island that not one original settler from Mexico has ever seen this animal. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these animals. And the bay is a phenomenal place for this animal to hang out with the snook and the pargo and all the slow moving fish that live in these mangroves. They've never seen this animal before. This animal is a highly intelligent animal, and they're causing massive havoc to the research, which is fisheries research. And what I don't understand is a bill, a law, any of this stuff. You can put amendments on it to help change the attitude. If you look at the video Nate, right now, a fisherman's wharf in San Francisco Bay, and just try to count how many animals, just that place, just that place. Forget about everywhere else on the planet. Just try to count the amount of animals in at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco Bay. And I'm sorry. I'm just having a really hard time. And I don't know why, but I'm having a real hard time with 300,000. That number blows my mind. They're in the Sea of Cortez now. This animal's called the California sea lion, right? What are they doing down here in Mexico? What are they doing in Alaska? What are they doing in Washington? What are they doing in Canada? Spencer, what's a California sea lion in Canada for? Because there's too many of them. The population is so big they can't go to where they want to go. They don't want to be in San Francisco Bay laying on the docks. They want to be out on the Farallon Islands, hanging out in the rookery, making more babies. But there's no room. There's no room at any of these historic places that had the animal before. Now there's so many of them that they have to go to all these foreign exotic places like the Columbia River and Sacramento River and places that they've never been. And why do we know that? Because they've never found a pinniped bone in those places. They've never seen a bone there.
I have some questions. So, yes, as far we're not going to be able to prove or disprove the 300,000 today, but is that because Nate Noah's looking at a specific region and not factoring in the fact that they could be leaving to go in other places?
Um, well, I think that the stock estimate is also includes the main rearing rookeries for that species. So, um, I mean, it's just it's a publication that folks can find on NOAA Fisheries. It's
Okay.
it's it's just a stock assessment report for California sea lions.
Yeah. Okay. And then Spencer, I hadn't thought of that. Back however many thousands of years ago, did they travel up the river system chasing stocks?
Yeah, and they still do. And like David suggested, there would be it would be welcomed to have an opportunistic uh, sort of chance to harvest the sea lion or whatever because they provide so much protein and calories, but also you would have such complex fish weirs, fish traps on the coast that yeah, you could kind of lure them in and do things with them. And today, um, Nate, I'm trying to you pronounced uh, the fish eulachin. We would say
Yeah.
Eulachon. We would say Ulican just to make sure we're talking about the same fish.
Yeah.
Alaska, they say hooligan.
Yep.
Up here, uh, they'll chase the Ulican right into the river, and you see yeah, so many of them moving upriver. An interesting facet that my elders have told me is when you hunt one, you open up the stomach and look in the stomach, and often you can find like a rock, like a cannonball you would use for trolling. And it's because every year of the Ulican run, they swallow a new rock to be better at diving and cruising around in the water
Wow.
to chase the Ulican.
Oh,
And
they
yeah,
are so smart.
yeah, just a neat sort of like traditional ecological knowledge piece there of yeah, when we're hunting them in river, that's one thing to
Yeah.
look for.
That's so cool. I remember being a kid and seeing them go upriver. I do think I see more now than I used to, but that I didn't factor in them being an opportunity. It's a great point on both of your parts. I don't expect you, Spencer, to be totally up to date with government policy, but do we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act in Canada, or is that just in America?
Yeah, it's an American thing. There's probably facets I should know this because I'm supposed to be writing a book on it. Maybe I'll know it in the next little while. I'm looking at other species right now, um, but not to the same extent. Where I know it's so strict, where Alaskans are really talking about sea otter right now, and this like huge extreme of going to no sea otter and a whole bunch, and they're affecting the urchins, the abalone, the all the things.
So what's
Um,
stopping me now from going and getting one? What we know what the act is or what the
so
law is?
I think I wish I knew a black and white answer. Um, I think that it stems from uh, populations that were threatened due to the bounties during yeah, earlier in I don't know, 1930s, 40s, 50s. And then it sort of becomes this thing that I it's not very present in mainstream society, and there's not a value associated with money potentially, and there's so much money associated with protecting it. Um, I recently watched the documentary Angry Inuk, which is an amazing documentary, and the complexities of um, the banning of seal product sale in Europe and how that affected Newfoundlanders, but also the Inuk people, the Inuit in northern Canada, and this nuance of the Inuit saying, "Hey, we kind of need this industry, so we don't welcome destructive industries just to make a living," and how that extreme of protection groups that raise so much money off seal, even though it's a species that isn't really threatened anymore. It's the biggest money maker for donations because of all kinds of um, uh, mistruths and stories that past stories that have potentially been wrongs that have been righted, like the numbers bouncing back, but also just yeah, mistruths on the fur harvest. Anyways, all that I think is in culmination leads to people don't really have a taste for it. There's not a huge economic profit. And it's just like because of animal rights groups, it's too hot of a potato to touch. And so we're at where we're at. But I think yeah, I have this hope that that will change in the near future.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you. And that brings me perfectly into the next question about non-lethal measures. So, Nate, what are there any non-lethal measures to prevent pinniped predation?
Not well. Let's kind of go through the list. So, in instances where it's just been a handful of animals, where we've at one point used to try to find placement, a permanent placement in zoo or aquariums, that solves it. The animals were moved out of the system, and that's consistent with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In certain fish ladders or fishways, we've done grates basically that keep sea lions from accessing a fish ladder where it's at pinch point in an artificial structure, but at least allows salmon to pass through it, and that's an effective way. Now it doesn't prevent the predation that's occurring just downstream of that barricade, but that works. Um, Removing artificial haul out sites or things like that where it's not providing that loafing opportunity adjacent to an area of concern. That needs to be on the list. Um, the issues of putting people in a boat with firecrackers and trying to push or steer sea lions or harbor seals away from an area just really doesn't work. You can have temporary effectiveness sometimes with blasting of loud sounds. Now, sometimes sea lions will just swim with their head above the water to avoid that. Um, we in the past few years we've partnered with a nonprofit that has a relationship with a company. Um, oh, I believe in Eastern Canada, um, and they are using what's called a targeted acoustic startle technology. And what this device does is it startles or scares a harbor seal. So instead of just kind of like blasting rock music at it, and it's like after a while, it's like, okay, I'm now deaf and I'll continue to feed, or I have a temporary hearing shift, but it's not that big a deal. I'll overcome it because it's worth eating salmon or steelhead, this task device startles, and it's the kind of like when you watch a scary movie and the boogeyman jumps out at you and we all jump. It elicits that similar reaction, and it's not something that is a learned behavior. At least that's how the theory works. And so we have seen in some initial trials on a very small scale, like we've seen harbor seals hanging out, 30, 40 yards past from where they might otherwise be feeding right up against a concrete structure. So in that limited sense, it's effective. It at least allows not using a wall to try to trap adult returning salmon. But it's hardly effective across, the estuary or reducing predation rate in Puget Sound or things like that. So of the tools, they are very limited in application as far as for non-lethal. And under the Marine Mammal Protection Act for the United States, that's often what we're left with.
It's it sounds insane. Like I think about people 500 years ago and if they knew this was going to be a conversation, I just can only imagine what they would think. On that note, Nate, I'd love for you to hear, Dave, you had an interesting thought on a solution. Can you share that?
Yeah, Nate, we understand we can't talk about hurting the animal or death is not an option, but there was a time 10 years ago where we couldn't talk about this either because of cost effectiveness. But now the amount of damage that these animals are doing to private property, and I've heard the argument they were here first and all that stuff. Well, if you have any boats, if you have an operation where you take people whale watching or fishing, you need to be able to tie the boat up to some type of device. We call it a dock. These animals have taken over most of the docks in Southern California. And what my thought process, because like we spent, just us, just our family, we spent over 100 grand last year just repairing the damage that this animal did. Why can't we start doing like we do to cats and dogs? Why can't we start to spay and neuter the animal? Why is that not an option? Why is that not brought into a talks? No one wants to talk about it. And the population, I know 300,000 is the number, but we know really honest to God that it's way bigger than that, but we'll use the number 300,000. So 301,000, is that too many? Is that not enough? What? Because I know we're not gonna hurt the animal, but we could start to spade and neuter them because we're spending a ton of time trapping these animals in Southern California anyway. I don't know what goes on in Washington and Oregon, but in Southern California, we spend a phenomenal amount of money trapping the injured or sick sea lions and then taking them to rehab centers and nursing them back to health and then releasing them back to where they're starving to death or where they're having problems. And I think that the money would be better spent on education to spade and neuter the animals so the population doesn't get to these numbers that it's at right now, which I personally don't believe that the numbers are sustainable. Just by looking at what I look at in Southern California, I'm not up in Washington, but I've seen pictures from the fishermen up there, the commercial fishermen for say that fish squid, that see 100 to 200 animals in their net at night when they're wrapping the squid. And I'm just like, I don't understand. Why can't we spade and neuter them, or why is that not an option?
Yeah, well, this is where, unfortunately, April, you brought on somebody from the state and not from someone from National Marine Fisheries Service that has the ultimate authority to answer that question from Dave. But I will answer parts of it.
Okay.
So, yes, I do think spaying or neutering would potentially be allowed under the MMPA through a permit by NIMS. It's going to be falls under what type of management objective and things like that. So certain areas that I've talked about on the MMPA wouldn't apply, but there's other provisions of a waiver of the take moratorium that could be pursued. But let's just kind of walk through it just a little bit. So California sea lions that we see here in Washington, for instance, are all males, right? The females are staying further south, and these are males that are wandering up and feeding. So if we neuter the males, great. That's not going to have the population level impact when you're dealing with a harem type breeding style, right? Down, I mean, let's go back to the biology of the animal here. So you have that concern, and it's an awful lot of expense putting your hands on an animal to conduct a vet procedure to release it, and then it is still feasting on ESA listed salmon. So you're not providing the predation relief that we need in many places. Neutering the animals at Willamette Falls would not have saved that winter stock of steelhead. Wouldn't have done it. And so it's really not a viable option in terms of cost and effectiveness. So I appreciate it in this world of very limited opportunities. We need to be thinking creatively. So I give you a gold star, Dave, for that. And unfortunately, kind of, break out the pencil and do a little bit more math afterwards. I think we find ourselves at a dead end.
Well, no, I understand that, but we don't really, we're out of options. We have no option. They give us nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I said, within like we're, dealing with artificial haul outs or other haul outs, I think there's still opportunities there. The the 120 application that we did in the Columbia River and for Willamette Falls is proving out. We actually have authority to do that work in other areas. We just have not had received the funding from Congress or from the state to pursue it. So I feel like, there's another dial that I could turn, but I don't have the resources to do it. And then other instances, yeah, the barriers of the MMPA and this is something, this isn't my opinion. I can cite in 2018 April. Yes. Well, what was such a big deal of 2018? Well, another thing that happened in 2018 in that killer whale recovery report and the task force recommendations was for Puget Sound and the outer coast. They said, why don't we have the Washington State Academy of Sciences take a look at pinniped predation? Because we had really strong data sets with Bonneville Dam and the impacts of the run being consumed by sea lions. About 2 to 4% of the run observed at Bonneville Dam, and between 20 and 45% of spring Chinook between river mile 0 at the estuary and Bonneville Dam at river mile 140 something. So we knew what was occurring there. Why don't we kind of pull together the experts and take a look at what's going on with predation in Puget Sound and the coast? And the Washington State Academy of Sciences were contracted, and they came out with a report published in 2022, and they noted that the preponderance of evidence is that pinniped predation is inhibiting salmon recovery. They noted the political will needed to address this issue, and they noted that the Marine Mammal Protection Act effectively blocks opportunities to intervene. And so that's not a bunch of politicians, that's not a bunch of commercial fishermen, that's not a bunch of rec fishermen, that's not a bunch of tribes or First Nations individuals. That's a group of scientists that were saying, we see you need to intervene, and given the tools that you have, there's really not a way to do so.
Spencer, how would your people have dealt with this back then? I know it was a different time, but can you provide any insight here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious that we just had more pinnipeds. And yeah, when so much of your life is vulnerable to this ecosystem that you're a part of, it's just such a no-brainer. There is no um privilege to debate this thing that's going on. I often wonder, we're in this funny place where I think um, I don't want to say environmental organizations. I feel like animal welfare organizations really are because, yeah, I don't want to put a negative spin on environmental organizations because I'm an environmentalist, I'm a conservationist, all these labels you want to use. But there's this funny idea that like only Indigenous people should be engaging in that, when there's also this common sense piece that something more needs to be done or could be done. And there's nuance there. I think that if you brought it to a table with a lot of Indigenous harvesters, they would genuinely be worried of like, would there be enough for our people if all of a sudden you open the floodgates? And what's that nuanced conversation look like when this is our culture and we might make a living out of the hides and turning that into whatever to sell or all these things. But yeah, it's definitely a conversation. It's interesting to hear this perspective from our neighbors to the south because it's kind of like a no-brainer, and I think it's less extreme on the coast here of that energy around protecting them. Um, and I am, yeah, learning so much myself. It's just kind of mind-blowing. And again, I've heard like Alaskan Native people talk about this, but it didn't fully sink in on like the importance of like Alaskan natives. From what I understand, you can't, there's a ton of regulations and red tape around at what point you're allowed to sell the item as well.
All right.
So you can't like, yeah, there's so much red tape that it's almost a chore to harvest enough to make it profitable, to jump through all the hoops to make it worthwhile, where it's you're losing money making it a full-time job just to like try to find a balance in harvesting some of these species.
Yeah, that's another good point.
And
And just to add in and build on what you're sharing, Spencer, the MMPA and the ESA restrict possession of parts, and so for individuals that are participating in an exemption of ESA or MMPA and lawfully harvesting animals like Alaska Natives would be, at least for the U.S., um, their handicrafts, oftentimes need to have paperwork associated so that it shows that it was from a legitimate harvest, and so that complexity definitely is factors in. Um, Another item that you mentioned, I want to call out that's in that Washington State Academy of Sciences report, which had to do with managing uncertainty. And oftentimes, I think especially when a question might be framed to scientists, is they're going to give the answer and they're going to explain that uncertainty and put confidence intervals around the estimate, and may even call out like, hey, here's the additional research questions that we would need to ask to more fully answer that question. And I think what's pretty noteworthy in the Washington State Academy of Sciences report is they recognize how imperiled Pacific salmon populations are. And they basically said, and these are my words, not from the report, but they said, don't let analysis paralysis get in our way here. What they did say, and that's my version of wording it, but what they did essentially say is we should proceed in the face of uncertainty. And some of the uncertainty that they called out, which was part of our scope of work for them, was we asked about like Pacific whiting. So harbor seals, for instance, eat hake or Pacific whiting, and whiting also feed on outmigrating smolts. And so one argument might be is that, hey, if we're removing harbor seals to the extent that it caused a release of hake, wouldn't that actually backfire and the salmon predation be worse because now the hake population has exploded and they have more mouths than the harbor seals and their metabolic requirements from the animals that you removed? And they basically said, let's not go down those traps. They also noted on the converse about saying, hey, transient killer whales, one of the ecotypes up here that's doing very well of killer whales as opposed to southern residents, transient killer whales eat harbor seals and sea lions. And so if there were removals of those pinniped species, would that harm the transient killer whale population? And number one, any type of removal that we're talking about is going to be a very small proportion of the potential biological removal that probably would not have that population level effect of pinnipeds, and thus there would still be ample prey for transient killer whales, and thus don't let that uncertainty stop you from intervening for the sake of recovering salmon. So I thought it was really interesting. The Academy of Sciences had identified and anticipated questions about people kind of doing the whataboutisms. Well, what about this and what about that? And they kind of said, folks, we know the threats on salmon. Predation in certain areas is unchecked, and there probably needs to be the means to intervene. And let's not let some of these other uncertainties prevent us from engaging in the way that we need to in response to an already highly altered ecosystem.
Dave,
Yes.
I just didn't know if you wanted to ask anything. I'm just going through my notes here, and you're doing so great, Nate. And I promise we'll wrap it up soon. But those are two major key points I wanted to focus on. As far as the orcas go, do we know what percent of their diet is salmon versus sea lions or seals?
There, there's different, like you said, there's resident killer whales that eat salmon. There's different families of killer whales. And I'm only knowing this from whale watching for 30 years. This is what I believe, but Nate knows way more about it than I ever will. There's a group that we have down here in Southern California that you probably saw on the news last week, the dolphin eaters. It's an incredible show when they show up and they eat the dolphins. And I know it sucks if you love dolphins, but man, if you're a whale watch guy and when you get to watch it, it's an incredible experience to watch them hunt the dolphin. And they're very good at what they do. And then there's another group that only eats pinnipeds. And there is a group that only eats yellowfin tuna. They live down here in Cabo and they eat yellowfin tuna, and that's what they eat. These are very high, these are highly intelligent animals. And there is a group, and I don't know the word you used, Nate, but you're very eloquent with the words that eat salmon. That's their food. Now, I like chocolate ice cream. I don't like vanilla. I'm only eating chocolate. That killer whale group only eats salmon. That's why they're in peril. They only eat salmon. They're not coming off the salmon to eat the sea lion or the seal, right, Nate? Am I correct?
Yeah, I think to build, Dave, I'm right there with you as far as the concepts here and describing in for the killer whale species, we generally view there's three ecotypes. There's the resident killer whales, which here we have northern residents and southern residents, and they are salmon specialists. And then of the salmon species, they are fixated on Chinook. I mean, they will swim through schools of another species of salmon to access Chinook running a little bit deeper.
Isn't that wild,
And
April?
then they'll
I have
shift to
no idea.
chum when the chum run comes in. But that is their focus. A second ecotype of killer whales is transient killer whales, or also called Biggs killer whales, and they're the marine mammal specialists that Dave was describing. And then the third type is called offshores, and we know the least about them, but they'll feed on sharks and tuna, et cetera, and tend to be larger pod sizes, smaller size killer whales, but swim in larger groups, and they're ranging further out.
This is so
The
interesting. Go
And
ahead,
this
Spencer.
animal is incredible. This is one of the most incredible animals on the planet, right, Spencer? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've like you, I've had the privilege of watching them hunt before, and I was just we have some whale researchers who live in our territory. For those that don't know, my village is quite remote and only accessible by boat or seaplane, and it's essentially just us in our territory. But we have whale researchers living at a cabin, and so there's lots of great research coming in. And I was just brushing up, and the two species, I just did a quick Google looking at some of the research, actually have separated like 250,000 years ago or something. And so they're very distinct.
Yeah, like
And yeah, the the mammal feeding ones are often in smaller groups as well. But we would wonder if more were going to show up because in our neck of the woods, there's also an abundance of humpback whales. And I've got to see them hunt sea lions, but also I've seen them take down a baby humpback whale. But all these species are affecting salmon, like whether it's the transient killer whales, the residents, the seals and sea lions, all the humpbacks who are relying on the local herring, all of them are in such a nuanced relationship with each other. I just wanted to add and drive that point home because it is so interesting.
One of the most misunderstood things about the killer whale is people think they eat everything. They don't. They eat what they like. And like Nate said, they've watched them swim through giant schools of coho. And you're like, where are they going? They're headed straight to the king salmon. They know he's got the most fat, he's the biggest, he's the best, and that's the only thing they want to eat. And they're not coming off of it. And that's what happened in 2018. That's what scared the heck out of all these scientists. They're like, uh-oh, why is the killer whale starving to death? What's going on here? Because, and I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but before 2018, we didn't have a full understanding of the killer whale, how they fed. They're like, why didn't they just come off the king salmon? Why didn't they just switch? And that's when scientists had to look and go, wait a minute. This animal's only going to eat king salmon. He's not going to eat anything else. So if we don't save this fish, we're going to lose the killer whale. And that's when the paradigm switched. And that's when it was like, well, wait a minute. The killer whales, wait, the big black and white dolphin that I met at SeaWorld, he's going to die because he can't eat a salmon because the sea lions ate them all? All of a sudden now sea lions were on the menu, which they'd never been before. They were like, wait a minute. And Nate'll tell you, it was a swing like no one had ever seen before. My dad came home like he just won the lottery. He was so excited. Finally, someone's paying attention to this animal, which I'm sorry to say, but this animal needed something to happen to him. And it's, Nate, can you go into this a little bit more, how it scared the heck out of these people?
Well, yeah, I think, to me, Dave, it wasn't so much there was like a scientific breakthrough in 2018. I think that people, I mean, southern resident killer whales are probably one of the more studied animals on the planet, quite frankly. I mean, every animal's named, they know each individual. They know its life history. They know who's related to who and which of the three pods. And their concern on their prey availability and the fact that they've been listed for as long as they have. I mean, we've had killer whales on our radar as managers. What I think really prompted and spurred the public interest here was when a southern resident killer whale female had lost her calf, and she had basically stayed with it for 17 days straight.
I watched that. It
And
was
pushed
awful.
it for hundreds of miles around the Salish Sea. And I think that struggle was, anthropomorphized, and people related to that and felt like, hey, we've got to do more. That the fact that these animals are listed is not sufficient. And that's what really drove, I think, the Governor Inslee at the time pulling together the task force. And there was a remarkable amount of state investment. The ESA and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, our responsibility is the National Marine Fisheries Service. But the state rolled up their sleeve. And as part of making these 30 plus recommendations to address the three main threats for killer whales: prey availability, vessel noise, and contaminants. So prey availability, do they have enough food to eat and reproduce and survive? Vessel noise, because they hunt through echolocation, and is vessel noise masking their ability to echolocate and find their prey, or just simply the disturbance of having vessels around them, monitoring them, viewing them, observing them all the time? Is that what's taking away their energy? Or contaminants, because marine mammals, very high on the food chain, and a lot of the contaminants are what's called lipophilic. They tend to attach to fat molecules. Well, marine mammals are loaded with blubber. April, you asked Spencer at the start of the show about, well, what does it look like as far as blubber content? Well, this is where that contaminant load stays. And if you're in a poor body condition, you're metabolizing your fat reserves, and those contaminants are now not locked up in fat, but they're through your system. And does that have endocrine disruptors and other complications? So those are the three main threats. We've known that for a long time, but I think the highly worldwide attention, the widely visible action of that killer whale pushing around her calf really was a compelling story to increase public investment. And as a result of that recommendations, I think the state invested across those three threats about $1 billion between fish passage and hydropower studies and pinniped conservation and management and vessel noise restrictions and regulating commercial whale watching and contaminant load studies and removing toxicants from the environment. This whole suite of activities advanced at once to attempt to recover killer whales.
So does public sentiment always, or in this case, can we agree that public sentiment outweighed actual science and the vulnerability of stocks? I mean, if it hadn't been polarizing and all over TikTok and all over the media, would they have made the same adjustments?
Well, I think the public sentiment here put a spotlight on what was needed to be done. I mean, all the actions have been captured in different recovery plans and species plans for decades. Now there was the public, and political will to invest in it, including amending the MMPA in 2018 to provide some additional management measures in the Columbia River. We've talked about how difficult and challenging it is in the court of public opinion to remove pinnipeds. But having it tied to killer whale recovery allowed, I think that, can't necessarily do a one-to-one, but it certainly helped us because we had been trying for 12 years to provide some flexibility on the Columbia River in the MNPA. And it was as a result of the task force recommendation that more visibility, I think, is why we got it passed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know that we're running out of time, and I know that we could talk about the entire coastline. I just am thinking about the audience and how many anglers are here and people who are passionate about the Columbia River system. And I know that you and I had spoke about that. What is the level of sea lion predation on ESA listed salmon in the Columbia River?
Yeah, so just real quick. So at Bonneville Dam, where we've have observers, and we being the broader natural resource management community here, these are actually U.S. Department of Ag employees and Army Corps employees at the dam, standing on a concrete structure, looking down maybe 300, 400 yards below the dam. They've observed between 2, sometimes up to 4% of the run being consumed. But that dam is at, river mile 145 or river mile 149. So how much predation is occurring downstream of that? And so NOAA Fisheries had done a study where they marked spring Chinook at the estuary and then tracked their fate. And we knew which, fish were caught in different fisheries and things like that. But there was a group that went AWOL. And so how do we attribute this? These are Chinook. We're not talking about coho that they may have strayed or they may have had a disease. These are robust Chinook. And depending on the year, it was between 20 and upwards of over 40% of the run was missing. And that missing marked rate was attributed to pinniped predation. I mean, that's what would have been available. And so when you think about, again, the hundreds of millions of dollars invested in salmon recovery in the Columbia River, and to have the most vulnerable life stage as adults getting ready to spawn be consumed at 20 to 40%, that was clearly an area that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So what are the management actions? Are those the ones we already discussed?
That's the removal operations we're doing at Bonneville Dam. We have the authority now to remove at the tributaries, but we don't have the funding to set up a second team and do those removals in those other areas. And so that's something that, we certainly have talked with individuals at both the state and federal level about the need to do that. Because here we have the authority, we know it's an issue, but we just don't have the resources to implement it.
Okay. Is there anything that I'm missing on this before we start going into wrapping it up, but also looking at moving forward, how we might be able to find a solution if possible? Is there anything that I'm moving too fast with Dave or in Spencer or Nate that you wanted to bring up or mention or ask?
Well, what I think the saddest part of this whole thing is we, the recreational fishermen, get blamed every time for everything. So, right, the narrative down here in Southern California right now, when a sea lion starves to death, is because the recreational fisherman is catching all their fish. Same thing happens in the Columbia River or in any of these areas. The first people that get things taken away from them are the recreational fishermen. Because we can't, the problem with the recreational fishermen, Nate, we can't agree on anything. The recreational fishermen will fight to the death. The commercial guys, they aren't going to give up anything. They're way smarter than us. They understand. But the recreational fishermen, we're going to fight each other on social media and just hand over everything to the closures and everything else because we can't get united. That's the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around. I talk about it on my podcast every day. And since we have this platform right now, and a lot of people are going to watch this, there's so many times where the recreational fisherman is blamed for the decimation of the salmon population. And I was so happy when you said somewhere between 20 and 40%. If, and I'm not taking anything away from you, Nate. I'm just talking about being in this industry for since 1974. When you guys use the word 20 to 40, we know that means 50 to 60. That's just me. That's me. I'm just me and you having a conversation, okay? If you guys are willing to say 20 to 40, then I know it's 50 to 60. But that's a huge number. If you guys said that number, oh my gosh, the whole planet would cave in on you. But to think that number, gang, just take that number. Let's just use the 20%. That's an extremely large number of animals that we're losing to this sea lion. And in Southern California, we did something, they hide it. And I sent April a couple of articles about it. And it's the craziest thing. Because I remember in the 80s when I was taking these researchers out and we were trapping sea lions and they were taking them back and they were vaccinating them for lungworm. They hid all that documentation. And I showed April 2 documents that I was able to find online. One says we vaccinated them, and one says we didn't. It's the craziest thing you've ever seen. Now, Spencer, tell your people that they vaccinate a wild animal and let me know how that goes over. They vaccinated this wild animal. We never saw a sea lion in the 80s over 400, 500 pounds. Now we see California sea lions all day, every day in the harbor that weigh 1,000 pounds. They're missing all their teeth. They have no teeth. It's like an old person. They lose their teeth. California sea lion average lifespan in the 80s, documented. All I have is what it says on Google, lived for 20 to 30 years. Now California sea lion lives for 40 to 60 years. They live so long that their teeth fall out of their heads. And then we nurse them back to health and we hand feed them food. I just don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. That's all I got.
Did they vaccinate them?
I couldn't speak to this. I haven't seen the story that Dave's referenced.
Yeah.
April's got it. She'll send them to you. I sent them to her.
It's a whole can. All right. So moving forward, what do we do to work together? Is there anything we can do, Nate, Spencer, Dave, to work together to do something apart from moving them and watching them come right back?
Unfortunately, I believe that we're at a point where that it's an impassment. We can't do anything. We're stuck with this problem because they're a cute, cuddly animal. And the world is spoken and it is what it is. And Nate's telling you real numbers that ought to scare the crap out of you. But that's not going to change the culture of America. Like Spencer said, his people, that's an easy fix. It would be fixed. It's not even a thought. They wouldn't even think about it. But we all know we know every single person sitting here knows the fix, but we're not allowed to do the fix. Spencer If you and your people want to go do the fix, I will become one of your relatives tomorrow morning.
Get in line, Dave.
Um, I two things. There is one way you asked, I wanted to make two corrections, April. There is one way you could harvest seal, and that's if you, I think, moved to Newfoundland and became a resident and was like a subsistence sealer or a commercial sealer, because it still exists. But you're a bandit, and so it sort of, yeah, made it harder. And the killer whales, it's actually 750,000 years. Mind blowing. Common
Unbelievable.
ancestor, 750,000 years ago. Anyways, yeah, so there's this piece about policy and I think government where that Nate was sort of alluding to. You kind of have to just like dip your toes into the unknown. So if Spencer could wave a magic wand, I think what we need to do on the coast of British Columbia, which again, I think will happen in the near future. I have no idea how this could pan out in the States. Maybe there'll be momentum, but I think we're on the edge where, yes, Indigenous people can harvest them. There's a little asterisk there because most Indigenous people can harvest them. There's complexities if you've negotiated a treaty and DFO oversees that modern treaty and things like that. Where First Nations people, Indigenous people should be able to take non-Indigenous people, resident hunters, non-resident hunters as a guide. And that's a very easy sell, I think. And in my mind, that's like a perfect scenario to start off with, where it's it'd be pretty hard for animal protection groups to argue against this process if Indigenous people are saying themselves, we need more seal harvested in our territory. We're going to invite people to do it with us because we harvest as much as we can already. And also empowering Indigenous rights in a way that Indigenous people can choose how many hunters they bring in, how many they guide. It also props up cultural knowledge in a way that now potentially every community would have a community member that's the seal or sea lion person. That there's that continuous knowledge. They would have full-time job, potentially economic opportunities. And then from there, like maybe you pursue this model, it can turn into something bigger. But I just had this conversation with someone who works in the seal world in Canada, and that sort of like dipping your toes is a possibility in the coming years. But again, with that Marine uh, Protection Act, like I don't know what it would take to make that step. And maybe if that model's done by British Columbia, there would be momentum though.
I love that. I love that full stop. Nate, I'll leave this to you to kind of wrap up. Would you mind addressing that? And then again, any other solutions that might come to mind?
Well, the MMPA is one of those kind of landmark pieces of legislation, and I think that there's a more broader, a real reluctance to touch it. I mean, it took us 12 years of interacting with Congress before we got it amended in 2018, and that was for a very limited surgical authority for removals at an area where we had incredible scientific support for what the problem was. Um, so I just recognize how challenging that is. And there are provisions that probably need to be fully explored and kind of exhausted for the MMPA. We talked about removing artificial haul out sites and things like that. Is that something that can be funded and resourced? Not going to solve the problem writ large, but it might help in a couple estuaries of concern. Um, but salmon recovery requires a full court press. And it's across all the threats. And so I think, you know, Dave, I appreciated your comment about how folks are kind of finger pointing at one another and kind of cannibalizing ourselves, so to speak. And that's what we can't be doing across a lot of sectors, not just rec fishers or commercial fishers or tribal First Nations peoples. This is a societal issue, and it's on all of us to try to fix it. And that requires improvements on fish passage. That requires investing in habitat restoration. That requires policy folks to not get the habitat in the spot that requires to restoration, but let's just protect it in the first place. That's a lot cheaper than going back and trying to restore it after it's been harmed. There's changes to hatchery practice. There's changes on harvest. We've explored those, and as part of this puzzle, pinniped predation can be a limiting factor in certain systems. And so, just like the same effort and zeal that we need to put in some of these other areas, I don't think that we should have like pinniped predation or avian predation or some of the other things just could be off limits. Where it's a problem in an altered ecosystem and we should be able to intervene and it's a worthwhile endeavor, then it should be on the table for consideration. And so that's kind of our perspective at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We're working across all fronts to try to recover salmon.
This has been great. I cannot thank you all enough for this. I really appreciate it. It was a tricky one, and I feel like we covered a lot of ground. You had some great points about the whatabouts. I can see how there are a lot more whatabouts than I thought. Is there anything that anyone wants to add before we wrap it up and let you get back to your evenings?
Thank you, Nate, for being here. And Spencer, thank you guys. I learned a lot today and I appreciate I can listen as well as I can talk. That's for sure.
It was a great discussion. I appreciate the invite, April, and it was great visiting with you, Dave, and you, Spencer. Take care.
Thanks, Nate.
Likewise, yeah, just so stoked to be on the podcast again.
Yeah. Oh, well, you and we have a date. We need to meet up again. It was great to see all of you. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, April.
Okay.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye all.